They say you can't get lost if you follow the trail. But what if the trail itself wants you gone? Tonight, Dread Scribe writes again. The morning had been ordinary, almost deceptively so. The trailhead stood at the edge of the forest, marked by a wooden sign carved with neat letters and dotted lines showing a loop. A 2-hour hike, the ranger had said. Perfect for newcomers. My boots pressed onto gravel with a steady crunch, a rhythm that gave me comfort. Every journey begins with trust. Trust in the map, the markers, the very ground beneath your feet. But trust is fragile, like chalk that vanishes the second water touches it. At first, the path was clear, almost too clear, cutting through a sea of pine needles that smelled of resin and sun-warmed bark. I kept glancing at my compass, the red, needle quivering but still pointing north. I even pulled out my GPS, its digital screen glowing confidently. I was exactly where I should be. Yet, a nagging thought whispered that the forest had its own logic, one I couldn't download or fold into my pocket. After an hour, something subtle shifted. The gravel beneath me thinned, patches of dirt interrupting the sound of my steps. Silence expanded like water filling a glass. The birds that had chirped from the canopy went mute. Even the insects seemed to fold their wings. Trees loomed taller, closer together, their trunks curving as though bending toward me. I wondered if this was how prey feels when the predator tightens its circle, not with teeth or claws, but with shadows. I walked faster, reassured when the trail widened briefly, only to watch it narrow again as if retracting into the earth. The painted blazes on tree trunks grew fewer, then vanished. My compass needle began to spin, jerking like a lie detector in panic. North became east, then south, then something else entirely. When I checked the GPS, its icon placed me adrift in blank space, as though the satellite had erased this section of forest altogether. How can you be lost in a place that supposedly doesn't exist? My throat tightened. I told myself that trails don't vanish. Erosion erases them slowly, seasons bury them, but they don't dissolve in minutes. And yet, each step forward was like walking into a painting someone had smudged with their thumb. Branches scratched my sleeves, low roots twisted like snares under my boots. The gravel sound that had steadied me was gone. All I heard was the soft give of soil swallowing my footsteps. I stopped, straining to catch a hint of human order, the drone of a plane, the whine of a distant engine, anything. But the forest offered nothing. It felt staged, as though the world had been stripped of background noise just for me. That silence was heavier than thunder. I forced myself to keep moving, clinging to the idea that trails are made by repetition. If I just pushed forward, I would find the imprint of someone else's boots, a marker, a break in the trees. But the forest was rewriting itself with each step. Every clearing looked like the last. Every cluster of trees became indistinguishable, like mirrors reflecting the same image deeper and deeper. And then I realized something chilling. I hadn't seen my own footprints behind me. The dirt was smooth, undisturbed, as though the ground had closed its skin over the wound of my passing. Trails, after all, are just scars etched into the earth. But scars can fade. I froze, heart hammering, staring at the blank earth behind me. That's when the question hit me like a cold wind. What if the trail wasn't lost at all? What if it had chosen to vanish? I turned in a slow circle, my breath shallow, trying to anchor myself to something real. The compass needle quivered uselessly, the GPS screen dimmed into a gray haze, and for the first time in years I felt the old panic that comes from being a child in a crowd, when the hand you were holding slips away and every face is suddenly a stranger. The forest had become that crowd, infinite and unrecognizable. I forced myself to think rationally. Trails don't think, I told myself. They don't erase footprints, they don't breathe down your neck. It's just geology, erosion, my own nerves. But deep inside, I felt like a pawn in a larger game, the board rearranging itself every time I moved. The trees pressed closer, their bark rough with moss that looked like veins. The canopy sealed over me, muting the light until noon looked like dusk. I remembered reading about cognitive mapping, the brain's way of stitching together space, landmarks, and direction into a mental picture. But what if the inputs stop making sense? If the world redraws itself faster than you can memorize it, then the map in your head collapses, leaving you stranded in white noise. I realized my mental map had already unraveled. I wasn't retracing a trail. I was wandering inside a maze that shifted behind me like a snake's coils. The air grew heavy, damp with the smell of loam and roots. My mouth dried, every swallow tight. I stumbled forward, searching for evidence of humanity. A boot print, a candy wrapper, even the jagged stump of a cut tree. Nothing. The ground was smooth, pristine, as if no one had ever walked there. The forest wasn't just old, it was primeval, coded like a secret. And then I heard it, the crunch of gravel. My heart surged with hope. I spun, certain the trail had returned, but the sound hadn't come from beneath my boots. It had come from behind me. I froze, every nerve wired with electricity. The silence that followed was cavernous. I told myself it was just an echo, some trick of sound bouncing through the timber. But then the crunch came again, deliberate, measured, as though someone, or something, was mimicking my stride. I called out instinctively, my voice ragged in the hush, but the forest swallowed it whole. No echo, no answer, just trees, their branches twitching like fingers in the wind. Yet I could feel it, the presence of something that had always been there, watching, waiting, walking just close enough to let me hear. My pulse thundered in my ears as I pushed onward, desperate to outrun the sound, but the path refused to appear. The trees funneled me through a corridor of shadow, and the crunch of gravel followed at intervals, always keeping pace. I tried to leave markers, snapping branches, scratching bark, but when I glanced back, the forest stood unbroken, seamless, as though it had healed itself in seconds. It struck me then. Trails don't vanish like chalk. They vanish like memory, selective, elusive, slipping away the harder you chase them. Maybe the trail hadn't disappeared. Maybe it had never been there at all. And as I stumbled into a clearing, my legs weak with exhaustion, I realized the truth that stole my last breath of comfort. I was not walking on a trail that disappeared. I was walking on a trail that was never meant to leave gravity. It pulls the light out of the sky until the last streaks of orange vanish, leaving only the silhouettes of trees that stretch like black cathedral pillars against the stars. I had pitched my tent beneath a stand of towering pines, their trunks straight and unbroken, their crowns high enough to swallow the moon. At first it felt safe, enclosed, almost sacred, the kind of place where silence should reign. But silence never came. It began as a murmur, soft and shapeless, like static seeping through the air. I thought it was the wind threading its way through the needles. Yet when I checked my watch, I remembered that the wind had died hours earlier, leaving the night heavy and still. The air was too calm, too thick for movement, and yet the sound continued, a hush that was not random but rhythmic, as though syllables were being stitched together in a language just beyond my comprehension. I lay still in my sleeping bag, heart steady but alert, and listened. The whispers rose and fell, weaving in overlapping waves. Some parts surged clear, like voices pressed against a door. Others retreated into the distance, barely audible. My mind, desperate for sense, tried to translate them. Go back. Don't stay. But no sooner did I think I recognized the words than they dissolved again, breaking apart like mist. Science teaches us that the human brain is a pattern-seeking engine. When confronted with chaos, it imposes meaning, faces in clouds, voices in static, shapes in the dark. I reminded myself of this, trying to rationalize. Yet I had also read about infrasound, the low-frequency vibrations too deep for our ears to detect, but felt in our bones, known in our fear. Infrasound can unsettle the body, stir nausea, and plant dread like a seed in the chest. Could that explain the whispers? Were the trees themselves generating a frequency my body mistook for language? And still, another thought pressed harder. What if the sound wasn't carried on air at all? What if it was inside me? The pine trunks creaked as though leaning closer, their bark cracking faintly. I imagined them as a council, their voices entangled, conferring about the intruder in their midst. My fire had gone out, leaving the faint scent of ash that clung to the fabric of my tent. Darkness thickened like ink. My pulse became a metronome. In the silence between whispers, each beat louder, each pause longer. I sat up, unzipped the flap, and looked outside. The forest lay still, frozen in an unnatural calm. No breeze stirred the needles, no animals scurried across the ground. Yet the whispers swelled, louder now, an invisible chorus with no mouths. I spun my head left, then right, trying to find the source, but the sound had no direction. It seemed to seep from every trunk, every root, every needle that glistened faintly in the moonlight. And then it happened. A shadow passed across the thin fabric of my tent, tall and human-like, sliding silently from one side to the other. But no footsteps followed, no crunch of needles, no shifting of earth. Just the sound of whispers intensifying, curling into my chest like smoke. That was when I realized the truth. Whatever was speaking, it wasn't out there. It was already inside. The realization hit me with the weight of cold iron. The whispers were not born on the night air, but seated within me, like roots threading through soil. I pressed my palms against my ears, but it made no difference. The sound bloomed inward, not outward, vibrating in the hollows of my skull. It was like listening to a memory that never belonged to me, a voice embedded deep beneath thought. I told myself it had to be exhaustion. A mind deprived of rest invents phantoms. Sleep-deprived hikers have reported hearing voices, seeing lights, feeling presences that vanish come morning. But the cadence of these whispers was too deliberate, too measured. They rose in unison, dipped, then repeated, as though rehearsed. Patterns are what distinguish chaos from intention, and patterns, I was certain, were what I was hearing. I crawled from my tent, desperate for clarity, and stood beneath the pines. The night air clung damp against my skin, heavy with the scent of resin. Their trunks soared upward, impossibly straight, their crowns a lattice against the stars. The whispers did not fade. Instead, they magnified, clearer now, threading syllables like beads on a string. My body reacted before my mind did. I shivered, my breath shallow, the hair on my arms rising. Fear was no longer an idea. It was a chemical flooding my bloodstream. I tried to reason it out, clinging to fragments of science. Trees communicate. I remembered vaguely through underground fungal networks transmitting nutrients, even warnings. Some researchers call it the wood wide web. But what if those messages weren't confined to roots? What if communication was happening in other ways, resonances we barely understood? Could these trees be speaking, and had my mind simply stumbled onto their frequency? A sudden creak above pulled my gaze skyward. The branches swayed, though no wind moved, needles shivering like strings plucked by unseen hands. And in that motion, I swore I heard words form, fleeting, but unmistakable. Leave. The clarity of it hollowed my chest. The shadow returned, gliding between the trees. I could see it more clearly now, pale against the darkness, stretched tall as though sculpted from the night itself. It passed with the grace of smoke, unbound by footsteps. I stared, unblinking, waiting for it to break form, to reveal itself as nothing more than a trick of the moonlight. But it didn't vanish. It paused, as if aware of me, and the whispers swelled to a crescendo. The sound drilled into me, no longer a murmur but 1,000 overlapping voices, some high and keening, others low and guttural, all weaving together into a pressure that made my temples throb. My vision flickered at the edges like static. It wasn't sound anymore, it was command, pulsing through me with a weight I couldn't resist. I stumbled backward, hands clutching my head, desperate to shake it out. And then, just as suddenly, silence. The air emptied, so absolute it rang in my ears. The figure was gone. The trees stood motionless, innocent, their needles glinting under starlight, as though nothing had stirred them at all. I stood there trembling, unsure whether I had heard the forest, or if the forest had heard me. The fire crackled with a rhythm that felt almost human, as though it were trying to comfort me. Each snap of resin, each hiss of pine was a reminder that I wasn't completely swallowed by the black ocean pressing against the circle of light. The woods beyond were a wall, a living curtain where shadows swayed with the faintest movement of air. Inside that fragile halo of flame, I convinced myself I was safe, a lone island of warmth in an endless, frozen sea. But islands, I knew, are always watched from the horizon. As the night deepened, the fire's light shrank, its once bright flames bowing low into a nest of glowing coals. My courage ebbed with it, because courage tied to fire is nothing more than borrowed light. That's when I felt it, a weight, invisible but undeniable. The sensation of being observed is ancient, primal. It is not taught but inherited, etched into the marrow of survival. My chest tightened with it. My skin prickled as though every hair had become a sentinel. I wasn't alone. I lifted my flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark like a blade. At first, all it found were trees standing like pillars in a cathedral of silence. Then it landed on something that froze me in place. A glint, sharp, reflective, deliberate. Not the dull shine of glass, not the quick flash of dew. Eyes. They hovered in the dark, motionless, impossibly still. At first I told myself it had to be an animal, a deer perhaps caught in the beam, but these eyes were wrong, too high off the ground, positioned as if the creature stood upright, studying me with patience instead of instinct. Predators move, stalk, betray themselves with twitching muscle. But this was stillness weaponized, watching, waiting. My mind raked through explanations like a scientist sorting samples. Bears can stand upright. Owls' eyes can glint from high branches. Yet bears don't remain statues for minutes at a time, and owls blink, shift, flutter. The gaze I saw didn't blink. It didn't twitch. It anchored itself in the darkness like a lighthouse fixed on me, but with no promise of safety. The fire crackled again, and in its wavering glow, I felt the distance between me and those eyes collapse. They weren't just looking at me, they were measuring me. My instincts screamed in language older than words. Run. But where? Into the void beyond firelight, where the eyes lived? Or stay, clinging to dwindling flame until its last ember surrendered? Lowered the flashlight for a breath, hoping, begging the glow would vanish when I looked again. But when I swept the beam back across the trees, the eyes remained. Closer now, brighter, twin orbs reflecting more than light, reflecting intention. And in that reflection, I thought I glimpsed something unbearable. Intelligence. The kind that does not hunt for hunger, but for understanding. The fire snapped low, sparks spiraling into the dark like lost prayers. And I felt the truth settle over me like a shroud. The eyes weren't waiting for me to move. They were waiting for the fire to a trembling glow, its light a shallow heartbeat against the endless night. Shadows grew teeth at the edges of the clearing, sharp and jagged, ready to devour me once the last ember gave out. My breath came in short bursts, fogging in the cold as I tried to steady myself. Fear is supposed to sharpen you, to prime you for survival. But in that moment, it dulled me, smothering reason with the weight of something I could neither name nor fight. The eyes remained, gleaming with patient hunger, as though they knew time was on their side. I gripped my flashlight tighter, my thumb sliding over the switch slick with sweat. When I turned it on again, the beam sliced through the darkness with desperate urgency. The eyes caught it immediately, glowing back with an eerie constancy. They didn't flinch, didn't recoil, as animals usually do. Instead, they reflected the light like mirrors, like twin lanterns burning from within. I tried to measure their height against the nearest pine, my mind clawing for logic. Too high for a wolf, too still for a bear, too deliberate for coincidence. Thought of evolution, of how fear of glowing eyes had been coded into us by centuries of survival. The first humans, crouched in caves, must have felt this same paralysis when firelight caught a predator's gaze just beyond the circle of safety. We survived because we listened to that instinct. And yet, part of me resisted fleeing. Curiosity, that reckless twin of fear, urged me to keep looking. Because there was something in that gaze that felt aware. The silence around me thickened, broken only by the brittle crack of a dying branch in the fire. It was a sound too precise, too synchronized with my panic to be chance. My body jolted, every muscle quivering. I realized then that it wasn't only the eyes that were waiting for the fire to die. It was everything beyond it. The forest itself seemed to lean in, hushed and anticipatory, like an audience watching a curtain about to fall. I forced my voice into the night, a trembling attempt to claim my existence. The words fell flat, swallowed whole, as if the air refused to carry them. The eyes, however, reacted, not with movement, but with a faint narrowing, a subtle shift. Recognition. They had heard me. They understood. The last flame sputtered, coughing, sparks that spiraled upward and vanished into the canopy. Darkness surged forward like a tide, swallowing the edges of the clearing. My flashlight beam flickered, its batteries gasping their final reserves. When it dimmed, the eyes brightened in response, feeding on the absence of light. I knew then that I wasn't witnessing a predator waiting to strike. I was witnessing something older, something patient enough to wait centuries if it had to. It wasn't after my body. It was after the moment fire abandoned me, the moment I was truly alone. The flashlight stuttered once more, then died, plunging me into complete darkness. And in that blackness, the eyes moved. In every ranger station, there are stories that linger like smoke, clinging to the walls long after the teller has gone home. Some are harmless legends, shared to pass the time during slow nights. But others cling with a weight that feels heavier, like a truth that refuses to decay. One of those stories was about a man named Harlan Pierce, a veteran ranger who had patrolled these forests longer than I had been alive. One evening, he entered a gulch to investigate a call about strange lights. He never came back. The official reports were neat and tidy. A missing persons file, a vague explanation of disorientation, maybe a fall, perhaps an animal attack. But the rangers spoke differently when the radios were quiet, their voices dropping low. They said Harlan left signs, scattered in places, Only someone desperate would leave them. They said his last words weren't spoken but carved. That was what made me go. I wanted to see for myself, armed with maps, a radio, and the certainty that mystery could always be solved with logic. The trail into the gulch was narrow, hemmed in by ridges that leaned like shoulders closing in. Pine needles cushioned my steps, muffling the sound, and the air grew colder with each descent. I told myself the tension in my chest was nothing but the change in elevation, but deep down I felt something else. A resistance, like the woods themselves had grown reluctant to let me through. The first sign came quickly. A torn piece of green. Fabric snagged on a branch, its threads fraying like veins under glass. I crouched, held it in my hand, and felt my pulse accelerate. Harlan's uniform had been green. My mind tried to brush it aside. Coincidence, debris, something left by another hiker. But the nagging weight in my gut refused to let it go. Further along, the dirt bore the imprint of boot treads, but they were strange. Instead of leading forward, they circled the same tree again and again, a spiral stamped into the soil. It looked less like a path than a ritual, the desperate orbit of someone who had lost their bearings or their mind. I stood over them, tracing the pattern with my eyes, and realized how unnatural it was. A ranger of Harlan's experience didn't walk in circles without reason. What could make a man of decades of survival knowledge forget the straight line home? Then came the carvings. The bark of one pine was stripped away, letters gouged roughly into its flesh. They were shallow at first, almost like scratches. But as I followed the trail, they grew deeper, angrier. Words began to form. At one tree, it read danger. On another, don't. And finally, at the farthest edge of the gulch, carved so violently the wood bled sap that had hardened into amber, a single word: run. I stood frozen before that message, my hand grazing the grooves, where another man's last strength had been spent. It wasn't just evidence, it was a warning, but warnings point away from danger. What gnawed at me was the question Harlan never got to answer. Run from what? The word glared at me from the bark, its grooves filled with hardened sap like a wound that refused to close. I stepped back, the weight of silence pressing harder than before. My radio hissed faintly at my hip, static curling in and out as though something in the gulch was gnawing at the signal. Logic told me to mark the spot and turn around, but curiosity, reckless, stubborn, human, drove me deeper. After all, I had followed the trail this far. Could I stop just short of the truth? I pushed farther into the gulch, the ridges hemming me in like the ribs of a giant beast. The air was cooler here, unnaturally so, and smelled faintly of iron. My boots sank into soil that seemed damp even though there had been no rain for days. I scanned for more signs, half hoping, half dreading what I would find. It didn't take long. Another scrap of evidence waited at the base of a cedar, this time a sleeve, still attached to the shredded cuff of a ranger's jacket. The patch was missing, torn clean away, as though someone had tried to erase the identity of the man who wore it. I lifted it gingerly, and the image of Harlan's strong shoulders filled my mind, reduced now to fabric decaying in the dirt. What unsettled me most, though, were the boot prints beyond it. They didn't just wander. They doubled back, overlapped, and then stopped suddenly in the middle of a clearing, as though Harlan had been swallowed whole. No struggle, no drag marks, no blood. Just absence. I crouched, tracing the edges of the prints, when a sound slithered through the trees. A low groan, like wood bending under a heavy weight. I froze, my breath locked in my chest. At first I thought it was just the forest shifting, but then it came again, closer, layered with something that wasn't wood at all, something almost like a voice. My radio spat static so violently I flinched. Through the distortion, a shape of words surfaced, fragmented, stuttering. My name. I ripped the handset free, bringing it to my ear, and for a second, I swore I heard Harlan's voice, hollow and broken, calling for help. But the sound fractured, dissolving into static again, until only silence remained. My skin crawled. Logic faltered. Radios don't conjure the dead, yet something wanted me to believe he was still here wandering, waiting. I thought of the carvings again. Don't. Danger. Run. What if those weren't just his final acts of desperation? What if they were an attempt to keep others from following him into the same trap? A branch cracked behind me. I spun, flashlight. Beam slicing through the gulch. Nothing but trees stared back, straight, silent, endless. But the certainty of being watched weighed heavier with every passing second, as if Harlan's warning wasn't carved for himself, but for me. I tightened my grip on the light, my throat dry, the word run echoing in my skull. And in that moment, I understood the cruel truth. Sometimes evidence doesn't guide you to answers. Sometimes it lures you closer, just far enough. Before the forest decides you too shook like it was alive, its needle trembling in frantic circles as though caught between two contradictory truths. At first I laughed it off. Compasses can fail, magnetic interference, underground iron, even solar storms bending invisible fields. I told myself it was science, nothing more. But as the seconds stretched into minutes and the needle refused to choose, the laughter died in my throat. It felt less like malfunction and more like refusal, as if the forest itself had vetoed my direction. I stopped on the narrow trail, shifting the compass back and forth, willing it to steady. North should have been simple, constant, faithful. Yet the arrow spun like a lie detector exposed to guilt, quivering, then swinging toward impossible. Bearings. My boots pressed into damp soil that smelled faintly metallic, and I wondered if the ground itself was to blame. Still, something inside me whispered that it wasn't the earth's fault. It was deliberate, personal. Branches groaned overhead, long sighs that echoed like mockery. The wind had stilled, but the forest moved anyway. The creaks layered into sounds that were almost laughter. My gut tightened. It's one thing to feel lost. It's another to feel guided. Like unseen hands were tugging at your shoulders, steering you where they wanted. Every step forward left me uncertain whether I had chosen it or whether the woods had. I adjusted my pack, trying to reset my focus. Survival training drilled into me. Trust your instruments. But what happens when your instruments betray you? The compass was supposed to be truth carved into metal and magnetism, yet here it spun like a drunkard. I pulled out my phone, its glow harsh in the shade of the pines. The GPS blinked awake, the small blue dot pulsing as if trying to reassure me. For a moment, relief softened the edges of my fear. At least satellites don't lie. But when the screen loaded fully, my stomach dropped. The map displayed nothing but a white void, blank as fresh paper. No contour lines, no trails, no landmarks. Just my location suspended in emptiness. The forest, it seemed, had been erased. I stood still, listening. The silence pressed closer, thick enough to feel against my skin. My ears strained for a river, a bird call, even the scrape of a squirrel. Nothing. Just the faint electric buzz of my own nerves. It was the kind of silence that feels curated, as if the world had been muted on purpose. My legs moved without command, pushing me forward down a trail that didn't quite exist, a ribbon of dirt that narrowed with every step. It felt like walking deeper into a painting someone hadn't finished, the edges blurred, details half-drawn. I glanced back only once and wished I hadn't. The path behind me had sealed into darkness, trees knitting together as though they'd grown just to hide where I had come from. The compass needle spun faster, frantic, like a heart on the edge of collapse. I closed my fist around it, shaking, the weight of realization crushing me. Maybe it wasn't broken at all. Maybe it was trying to show me a map only the forest understood, and what if that map didn't lead out? I clenched the compass so tightly, the edge dug into my palm, a tiny half-moon of pain to remind me I was still flesh and blood, not just some pawn drifting inside the forest's will. But even that sting felt insufficient, like the woods had numbed me to everything except its own rhythm. The trees towered above in serried ranks, their tops swaying though no breeze touched the ground. It was as if the compass needle wasn't the only thing spinning. My thoughts circled too, endlessly returning to the same point. Trust nothing. I lifted the device again. The arrow twitched, then locked for a moment, pointing straight into the thicket to my right. Hope flared, thin and desperate. Finally, direction. I pushed into the brush, branches clawing at my sleeves, pine needles needling my face. For 10 minutes I trudged, following the line the needle demanded. Then I stopped, panting, and checked again. The arrow had shifted, mocking me, now pointing behind me as if ridiculing my progress. I wasn't moving toward something, I was orbiting. In frustration threatened to boil into panic. I thought of old stories, of compasses turning circles inside places considered cursed, magnetic anomalies where pilots and hikers vanished without explanation. Bermuda had its triangle. Maybe this gulch had one too. Yet the sensation gnawing at me wasn't one of randomness. It was intention, like a crooked finger wagging, luring me deeper with the pretense of guidance. Desperate for certainty, I pulled out my phone again, praying the blank map had corrected itself. The screen glowed, battery draining faster than it should have. My pulse quickened as the blue dot blinked, loaded, and nothing. Still the same void. No roads, no trails, not even the jagged outlines of mountains that should have been unmistakable. Just whiteness, infinite and cruel, with me centered in the middle, like a specimen pinned to glass. My throat tightened. Maps are promises, contracts, between the world and its explorers. And here, the contract had been shredded. I wasn't misplaced. I was erased. I stumbled back toward where I thought the trail had been, my boots snapping dead twigs that seemed to break too loudly in the silence. Overhead, branches groaned again, the sound riding down the trunks like a warning. The forest wasn't passive anymore. It was participatory, bending reality in ways that were both subtle and merciless. The compass needle slowed, then stilled. I almost dropped it in shock. After hours of spinning, it pointed now with terrible certainty. North, or what claimed to be north. My chest heaved, torn between relief and dread. The arrow no longer quivered. It was steady, absolute, too steady. Raised my eyes along the bearing, following the line the compass drew, and that was when I saw it. A corridor between the trees, unnaturally straight, as if carved by intention rather than erosion. It led deeper into the forest, its mouth yawning black. For the first time, I didn't feel the compass was lying. I felt it was delivering me exactly where it wanted me to go. I stood trembling, torn between the sanity of turning back and the pull of that impossible path. But when I glanced behind me, the trees had shifted again, sealing the way I came like lips pressed closed. The compass needle didn't waver. It pointed forward, into the corridor, demanding obedience. And I knew then, with a clarity colder than fear. The forest wasn't guiding me out. It was guiding me in. My legs ached with the dull weight of miles, every step dragging like a stone tied to my ankles. Hunger gnawed at me, thirst scraped my throat raw, and the forest seemed determined to smother me in its endless sameness. So when I saw it, a faint orange glow pulsing between the trees, it felt like salvation had finally cracked through the wall of despair. A campfire, civilization, proof that I wasn't the only soul swallowed by this wilderness. Relief surged, hot and dizzying. I quickened my pace, branches clawing at my arms as I pressed forward. Then came the voices, faint, almost melodic, weaving through the pines in a way that lifted the heaviness from my chest. Laughter, low and human. For the first time in days, I felt tethered back to the world. My boots crunched louder, my pulse racing with the anticipation of company, of safety, of light. I broke through the last line of trees, breathless, expecting, faces illuminated by fire. Instead, I froze. The clearing lay empty. The fire that had beckoned me was gone, reduced to a ring of blackened stones. Ash still clung to them, faintly glowing, as though the flames had been smothered just moments before my arrival. The voices, the laughter, the warmth, they evaporated like smoke, leaving only the eerie silence of a stage after the actors have fled. I crouched, my hand brushing across the stones. Warmth kissed my fingertips, undeniable, like a lingering ghost of flame. I lifted them to my nose, and the sharp sting of ash filled my senses. This wasn't imagination. Something had been here. Then I saw the footprints. Dozens of them, overlapping, pressed deep into the soil. They radiated outward from the fire ring in every direction, but none led in, none led out. They ended abruptly, as though the owners had simply dissolved into air. I circled the clearing, tracing their patterns, my stomach sinking with every unfinished step. This wasn't abandonment. This was erasure. The rational part of me clawed for answers. I had read of phantom camps before, collective hallucinations where weary minds conjured sound and firelight in the wilderness. A trick of fatigue and isolation. But hallucinations don't leave soot beneath your fingernails. They don't leave heat smoldering in stone. Evidence lingered like fingerprints. And evidence, I reminded myself, doesn't lie. Unless it wants to. The forest loomed heavier around the clearing, the trees forming a ring as tight as the stones, as though guarding whatever ritual had taken place here. I imagined figures gathered in the dark, speaking in hushed tones, extinguishing flame the instant they sensed me drawing near. But why erase themselves so cleanly? What had frightened them enough to abandon without trace, without warning? I sat, my pack down at the edge of the fire ring, too tired to question my own recklessness. If this space had sheltered others, perhaps it would shelter me too. I pitched my tent, the nylon walls glowing faintly in the moonlight, and laid down in the very spot where their voices had carried, yet sleep didn't come. My mind replayed the scene again and again, the warmth of stone, the footprints that went nowhere, the laughter that vanished mid-breath. And as my eyes fluttered closed, one thought cut deeper than the rest. If they could vanish without a trace, what would stop the forest from making me next? The thin fabric of my tent, like an ocean against glass, heavy and absolute. I lay still, listening to the forest breathe, or rather not breathe. No crickets, no owls, not even the distant groan of shifting branches. Just silence, dense enough that I could hear my own pulse. It felt as though the woods were holding their breath, waiting. Sleep finally claimed me in fragments, a restless drift broken by sudden starts. I dreamed of voices circling the fire, low and urgent, though I could never catch the words. When I startled awake, the clearing was dark, the stones of the extinguished fire faintly glowing with trapped heat, as if they remembered flames better than I did. My skin prickled with the certainty that someone was watching. I unzipped the flap and peered outside. The clearing lay empty, the footprints still stamped into the soil like unfinished thoughts. Yet something about them seemed changed. I stepped barefoot into the night air, the ground cold and damp beneath me, and crouched by the tracks. They were shallower now, faded, as though the earth had begun to swallow them back. A shiver ran through me. Footprints don't fade overnight. They last until rain or wind carries them away. But here, the soil seemed to repair itself, erasing evidence grain by grain, reclaiming what had been left. It was as if the forest rejected even memory. I stood frozen, the silence pressing harder, until I caught it again. A sound so faint I thought it was a trick of exhaustion. A laugh carried just beyond the tree line. Not loud, not mocking, gentle, almost warm. I turned sharply, flashlight in hand, but the beam met nothing but black bark and tangled undergrowth. Still, the laugh echoed inside me, as vivid as if it had brushed past my ear. My hands trembled as I lifted the light toward the stones. That was when I saw it, a thin plume of smoke curling upward, faint but undeniable, like a ghost lingering long after death. My breath hitched. The fire was relighting itself. I crouched close, heat blooming against my face, and felt dread sink its claws deeper. The stones pulsed with warmth, their edges glowing faintly. But there was no wood, no fuel, nothing to explain the embers' return. Just heat rising from nothing. I drew my hand back sharply, the smell of ash clinging to my fingertips again, fresher this time, as though the camp had only just been abandoned. I staggered back toward my tent, but when I glanced at the footprints again, my chest hollowed. They were gone. The ground where they had been was smooth, pristine, undisturbed, as if no one had ever walked there, as if I hadn't traced them myself only hours earlier. Panic clawed up my throat. I wanted to grab my pack, to leave the clearing immediately, but my legs refused. I stood rooted, my light shaking, the smoke rising higher, the warmth intensifying. The camp wasn't gone. It was vanishing in real time, pulling itself into nothing before my eyes. And a question I didn't dare answer unfurled in my mind. If the camp could erase itself so completely, what would stop the forest from erasing me too? The fog came without warning, spilling down the ridges like water poured from an unseen jug. Within minutes, the forest was swallowed whole, the trees reduced to faint silhouettes that stood like ghosts at attention. Sound dulled under its weight. Even the usual chatter of birds and insects vanished, as if the world had pressed pause. I pulled my jacket tighter, the air damp against my skin, every breath turning thick, almost chewable. I told myself it was fine. Fog was common in low valleys, a natural trick of temperature and moisture. Still, the gray felt more than natural. It felt staged, like a curtain being drawn across a stage I hadn't agreed to stand on. My boots crunched faintly on the leaf-littered trail, each step sharp in the silence, the only sound that reminded me I was real. Then came the other sound. At first I thought it was an echo, a delayed return of my own footsteps bouncing through the heavy air. Stop. Listen. Nothing. I exhaled, moved forward again, and there it was. The crunch, half a beat behind mine, mimicking perfectly. Stop again. Silence. But the cadence returned as soon as I walked, so precisely that it felt less like mimicry and more like choreography. I swallowed hard, rationalizing. Science calls it the phantom echo effect, where sound reflects strangely in mist, refracting like light through glass. But the fog was too thick for distance. These weren't sounds carried from behind me. They were too close, pressing into the space just beyond my shoulders. Each step came a fraction after mine, as though whoever followed was waiting for me to prove the ground safe first. My chest tightened with the knowledge that instincts rarely lie. Human evolution had carved that fear into me. The awareness of pursuit, the certainty that eyes bore into my back. My skin prickled, my breath shallow. Every nerve begged me to turn, to confront whatever loomed in the mist. But fear had its own logic, and it whispered louder, "Don't look." I pushed forward, faster now, my boots snapping twigs and scattering gravel. The echo stayed with me, unwavering, never rushing, never slowing, just keeping pace. My palms grew slick on the straps of my pack, and the fog seemed to thicken in response, closing the distance between me and the unseen. The trees blurred, their trunks bending like ribs pressing in, and I felt trapped in a lung I couldn't escape. When the trail curved, I dared a glance sideways into the mist, hoping to catch the form of deer, a stray hiker, anything human or natural. But the space between trees was vacant, filled only with the shifting gray. My heart hammered, each beat loud enough to drown the forest. Still, the footsteps persisted. That was when a thought struck me, chilling enough to stop me mid-stride. What if the sound wasn't just following me? What if it knew me? The silence deepened as I froze, waiting, listening. And then the next step landed, not behind me but beside me, so close I felt it in my bones. The step beside me rang louder than any sound I'd heard that night. Not because of its volume, but because of its nearness. The earth gave under pressure. That wasn't mine. A crunch against soil and stone that trembled up my legs. My chest seized, my breath cutting short as if the fog itself had clamped down. For a heartbeat I couldn't move, couldn't think. The forest was no longer just background, it was occupied. I forced myself to walk again, slower this time, as though pretending I hadn't noticed. But the air betrayed me, vibrating faintly with the next step, perfectly timed with mine now. It wasn't chasing, it was accompanying, an unseen partner in lockstep. My throat ached with the urge to shout, to pierce the silence with sound and reclaim some control. But terror pinned my tongue. Instinct told me words would only acknowledge it, and acknowledgement was invitation. The fog thickened, coiling low, to the ground, muting even my own movements. I could barely see the outlines of the trail beneath my boots, yet the cadence remained, undeniable, immediate. I remembered reading once that sound behaves differently in mist, refracting in ways our minds misinterpret. That explanation should have grounded me, but science doesn't account for the weight of breath on your skin when no one exhales. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my small flashlight, its beam a pale spear cutting 10 feet ahead before being swallowed whole. The circle of light trembled as my hand shook. I swept it sideways, desperate for proof of company. The beam revealed nothing, only trunks that seemed farther apart than they had moments before, as if the forest itself was stretching, opening space for something. I couldn't see. The next step came again, slightly ahead this time as though guiding. My skin crawled. The echo theory shattered in my mind. This was no reflection. This was a presence, intelligent enough to mimic, patient enough to remain unseen. 1,000 possibilities whirled through me, animal, human, hallucination. But none explained the deliberate timing, the way it pressed closer with every hesitation of mine. I stopped dead, muscles locked. The forest held still with me. My breath came ragged, clouding in front of my face. Seconds stretched into lifetimes. Then, from the fog at my right, another step landed, slow and intentional. The kind of step that announces rather than conceals. The sound was so close I felt it vibrate through the ground into my boots. Terror surged, but alongside it, something stranger. Recognition. Not of a face, not of a voice, but of rhythm. The steps matched not just my pace, but my pattern. The uneven spacing of my stride, the way I paused slightly before planting each foot. This wasn't just imitation, it was familiarity, as though whoever followed me had walked with me before. I wanted to turn, to rip the fog open and confirm what stalked the edges of my sanity. But I knew the instant I did, everything would change. The forest waited for me to look back, daring. Me. My lungs burned, my hands shook, my body balanced between fight and flight. And then the truth struck, colder than the mist itself. What if those footsteps belonged to someone I already knew? Someone who was never supposed to be here. Almost politely, a hollow note in the belly, a reminder that the body requires tending. But left unanswered, it sharpens, gnaws, and finally becomes a predator in its own right. I had run out of food days earlier, the last ration bar eaten so slowly I could taste cardboard in its absence. Water was no better. My canteen held only a few desperate swallows. Yet what unsettled me more than thirst or hunger was the feeling that neither belonged solely to me. The forest pressed in with the weight of something alive. The trees rose like the ribs of some buried leviathan, curving inward, making me feel less like a traveler and more like prey caught inside a giant chest. Above, the canopy closed like a mouth, the slivers of sky narrowing into teeth. My body wasted itself, yes, but I couldn't shake the sense that something else feasted alongside my decline. Every step grew heavier. My legs ached with the strange fatigue of being leeched, as though each pace siphoned more than energy. It siphoned essence. Science tells us the forest is indifferent, that trees do not notice the struggles of a man staggering beneath them. Yet stories from cultures across the world whisper otherwise. Sacred groves that swallowed intruders, dark woods that sapped travelers until their bones were left clean. The myths no longer felt like superstition. They felt like diagnosis. I stopped, at a puddle left by recent rain, my throat tightening with the promise of water. I knelt, scooping the surface toward my lips, when I caught sight of my reflection. The face staring back was mine, but hollowed. Cheeks sunken, eyes too wide, their whites stark against shadowed sockets. Worse still, the water trembled though no wind stirred it, the ripples distorting my image into something thinner, stretched. It was as if the forest was already shaping me into absence. I leaned closer, desperate to confirm or deny the hallucination. But the puddle deepened in appearance, swallowing my reflection whole until it looked like I was staring down a dark well. A pulse of fear shot through me and I staggered back, the taste of thirst forgotten. My stomach twisted not with hunger, but with the sensation of being eaten. Branches above creaked in unison, a groaning chorus like jaws tightening. My chest heaved as I remembered how scientists describe forests as nutrient-sharing networks, roots and fungi passing sugars and signals between trees. It was proof of cooperation, not malice. But what if that same network could draw from more than soil? What if it extended its appetite to flesh? My knees buckled and I sank to the dirt, the ground strangely warm beneath my palms. It pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat too large to belong to any single creature. My breath faltered as dread coiled inside me. Hunger was no longer an internal struggle. It was environmental, omnipresent, and it had chosen me as its meal. The forest loomed silent, patient, eternal. And in that silence, one question devoured me whole. What if my starving body wasn't dying because it lacked food, but because the woods were already feeding? I tried to rise, but my body resisted, leaden and sluggish, as if invisible vines had wound themselves around my limbs. The ground still pulsed faintly beneath my palms, a slow rhythm that matched neither my heart nor the earth's natural tremors. I yanked my hands back, but the impression lingered, tingling, burning, as though something beneath the soil had drawn a taste of me and now craved more. I staggered forward, clutching a tree trunk for balance, Its bark was rough, alive with ridges that pressed into my palm like teeth. I yanked away, leaving behind a smear of sweat and skin, and in that instant it felt less like I'd steadied myself and more like I'd been sampled. A transaction. The forest taking payment in flesh. The thought made my stomach convulse, but not with hunger, with loss. Each step grew weaker, not just from exhaustion but from a sense of being siphoned. The woods weren't draining my body. Like an open wound, they were consuming something deeper, some quiet core that kept me tethered to myself. I pushed through the undergrowth until the trees parted around another shallow puddle, larger than the last. The surface was still, glassy, as though it were waiting for me. I peered down, expecting the hollow-eyed reflection I had seen earlier. Instead, I saw something worse. My shape was there, but thinner, stretched unnaturally, as if my body had been elongated into a figure that didn't quite belong to this world. My ribs jutted, my jaw sharpened, my eyes sunken into black pits. It wasn't a reflection, it was a preview. I recoiled, but the image lingered even when I closed my eyes. The hunger inside me no longer felt like mine at all. It belonged to the forest, coursing through me like roots drinking rain. Survival instincts told me to find food, to keep moving, to live. But another instinct, quieter, darker, told me I was already too late. I collapsed to my knees, the ground oddly warm again, radiating upward into my bones. A wave of dizziness washed through me, and for a moment I thought I heard it. A chorus, low and endless, threading through the earth. Not voices exactly, but vibrations, the sound of consumption. The forest didn't roar, it didn't scream. It fed silently, endlessly, without mercy or haste. A shudder of panic snapped me upright. I staggered backward, clutching at my chest, the air burning in my lungs. The trees loomed tighter, their trunks pressing closer like ribs closing around prey. I clawed through them, desperate for escape, for any sign of break in the canopy. My hands shook as I grabbed at branches, snapping them aside, the wood slick with sap that clung to my skin like blood. At last I stumbled into a small clearing. My legs buckled, and I dropped onto the dirt, gasping. The silence pressed harder here, and when I looked down, I saw it. The ground beneath me was darkened, damp as though soaked, but not with water, with something heavier, something that reeked, faintly of iron, and then I understood. The forest wasn't waiting to consume me in death. It was already feeding, root by root, shadow by shadow, stripping me piece by piece while I was still alive. The forest had been unbroken silence for hours, a world stripped of direction, until my phone betrayed a flicker of life. I pulled it from my pocket, its cracked screen smudged and dim, expecting the familiar taunt. No service. Instead, my pulse quickened as a single bar appeared, wavering like a candle in the wind. In a wilderness this deep, it was impossible. Hope surged through me so violently it bordered on pain. A signal meant contact. A signal meant rescue. Then the notification appeared. The vibration rattled against my palm, sharp in the stillness. I thumbed it open, expecting the safety of a text from the outside world. Instead, the words froze me where I stood. Don't follow the trail. The sender's number was nothing but zeros, a string of absence masquerading as identity. My throat dried, a chill rushing up my spine. The rational part of me lunged for answers. I had read about electromagnetic interference in remote areas, how anomalies could mimic signals, even generate phantom messages. But those were garbled, incoherent, fragments of nothing. This was different. This was language, clear, direct, urgent. And that clarity terrified me more than any static. I stood in the thinning light of dusk, my eyes flicking from the screen to the dirt trail ahead. The words burrowed into me, echoing louder with each heartbeat. Don't follow the trail. Why not? The path was my only lifeline, the single thread weaving through the maze of endless trees. To abandon it was to embrace chaos. Yet to continue, after that warning, felt like stepping willingly into a trap. My thumb trembled as I tried to check the signal again, but the bar had already vanished, swallowed as quickly as it had come. I tapped the screen, desperate, and watched my battery plummet. 90%, 80, 60. The digits dropped in a freefall until, in less than a minute, the phone lay dead in my hand, its glow extinguished, leaving only my reflection in the glass. The weight of that dead device was crushing. It had spoken to me, and then it had gone silent forever. I couldn't decide which was worse, the message itself, or the proof that it had been delivered by something I could no longer reach. Darkness bled into the trees as the last of the sun folded away. The trail stretched ahead, its line faint, but visible, a promise of order. Yet the warning screamed in my head, "Don't follow." My mind clawed at possibilities. Was the forest itself whispering a survival instinct through wires and waves? Or had something darker learned to use human tools, baiting me with the illusion of help? I lifted my head and listened. The woods stood still, holding their breath. My body ached with exhaustion, my mind with questions. The trail waited, stretching into shadow. But the phone's words had etched themselves too deeply to ignore. What if the path I thought would save me was the very thing that wanted me gone, staring into the shadows where the trail dissolved? The forest had always seemed indifferent. Trees rising, wind shifting, animals moving unseen. But after the message, it no longer felt indifferent. It felt aware. The words echoed in my skull like a warning whispered into my ear. Don't follow the trail. I turned in a slow circle, the dead phone still clenched in my hand. Without its glow, the night pressed heavier, the silence deeper. My instincts warred, with reason. Every survival manual drilled the same rule: stay on the trail. Yet something older, more primal, tugged at me, urging me to step away. It was as though the forest itself had pulled a string tight around my chest, steering me off course. I took a cautious step off the dirt path, boots crunching against pine needles. The air shifted, cooler, carrying a faint metallic tang, as though the very atmosphere had changed allegiance. My heart thudded in my ears. Behind me, the trail stretched pale and narrow, like a vein leading into the body of something vast. To follow it felt like stepping into a mouth, but wandering blind into the trees was its own kind of suicide. Every rational thought screamed that I was risking disorientation, starvation, exposure. Still, the memory of that message burned hotter than logic. It hadn't just warned me, it had forbidden me. And part of me wondered if that prohibition was less about saving me and more about claiming me. I pushed deeper into the undergrowth, my flashlight beam jittering across trunks slick with moss. The forest seemed to close around me, each branch reaching down like claws to remind me I had broken a rule. Then, faintly, I heard it, a sound threading through the stillness. Not wind, not water, a rhythmic shuffle, like steps ahead of me. Froze. Blood icing. My beam scanned the fog between the trees, but there was nothing, just the suggestion of movement too quick to grasp. The steps came again, retreating deeper, drawing me forward like bait. My throat tightened. Whoever, or whatever it was, it wanted me to follow. I should have turned back. But the trail was behind me, and its memory pulsed in my chest like a trap I had narrowly avoided. Forward felt no safer, yet I moved anyway, compelled by something I couldn't name. Branches scraped my arms, roots clawed at my boots, but I pressed on. chasing the faint echo of footsteps that always stayed just ahead. Then the sound stopped. The silence returned, thick and suffocating. My flashlight beam swung wildly until it fell on something half buried at the base of a tree. A phone, black, cracked, identical to mine. I reached for it with trembling hands, my skin crawling. The screen flickered to life before I even touched it. And there, glowing in the dark, was a new message. You shouldn't have listened. After days of wandering through a labyrinth of identical trees, I emerged into a place that shouldn't have existed. The forest, dense and unrelenting, ended in a sudden circle of grass, perfectly round, unnaturally precise. It was as though the trees had marched to its edge and stopped like obedient soldiers, their trunks forming a disciplined wall around the space. Not one dared step closer. I stood at the boundary, trembling, my boots planted in soil that had carried me through exhaustion and despair. Yet here, at the circle's edge, I felt something shift. The air itself seemed different, clearer, charged, as if every breath carried static. My chest lightened, the weight of fatigue lifting for the first time in days. It was intoxicating, unnerving, but irresistible. I stepped into the clearing. The grass bent gently beneath my boots, springy and vibrant, glowing faintly in the moonlight that poured through an opening in the canopy above. My shoulders loosened, my legs steadied. For a moment it felt like sanctuary, like stumbling upon a chapel hidden in the heart of chaos. My body, hollowed by hunger and fear, suddenly felt less like a burden, and more like it belonged here. And yet, a whisper of caution lingered. I had read of such places, scattered across ancient myths and folklore. Thin spots, they called them, places where the veil between worlds wore down, fragile as silk. The Celts believed them to be portals. Indigenous traditions warned of circles where spirits gathered, where human presence was intrusion. Even science, careful and skeptical, admitted to anomalies, pockets of geomagnetic strangeness, zones where animals refused to tread. I lowered my pack and sank into the grass, its softness almost too perfect, like a bed prepared in advance. My head tilted back, eyes locked on the sky framed neatly by the circle of treetops. Stars blinked down, more vivid here than anywhere else I had seen, as though the clearing itself had polished the heavens for my arrival. My chest loosened further, and I felt a strange detachment, as if gravity itself had weakened. But peace never comes without price. As I lay there, the ground trembled beneath me. At first it was subtle, a faint vibration like the hum of distant machinery. Then it deepened, a pulse thrumming steadily through the earth, aligning with no rhythm I knew. It wasn't seismic, it wasn't natural. It was too deliberate, too alive. My hands pressed flat into the soil, and I felt it there, a heartbeat. The ground was not still, it was breathing. My breath caught as dread tangled with awe. Had I stumbled into the heart of the forest itself, or into the body of something older, waiting? The circle, the grass, the air, it all seemed less like accident and more like invitation. A stage set, a bed prepared, a place designed to catch wanderers who had nowhere else left to go. And as the hum beneath me grew stronger, one realization pulsed colder than the earth itself. It wasn't the forest that was lost. It was me. The heartbeat in the ground grew steadier, louder, until it seemed to sync with my own pulse. Each thrum reverberated through my ribs, making it hard to tell where my body ended and the earth began. My exhaustion had vanished, replaced by a floating sensation, as if gravity itself had thinned. For the first time since I'd entered the forest, I wasn't fighting it. The clearing was doing something to me, pulling me into alignment with its rhythm, like a tuning fork struck against bone. I sat upright, scanning the circle with a trembling light. The trees remained at their border, motionless as though held back by an invisible line. Their shadows stretched inward but never crossed. It was as if they too obeyed the authority of this space. That thought unsettled me. Forests don't obey. They dominate, spread, reclaim. Yet here was a perfect wound in its body, and even the oldest trunks dared not invade it. I told myself it could be explained. Geomagnetic anomalies, microclimates, the countless quirks of nature that fool our senses. But science didn't account for the way my skin tingled as if brushed by unseen hands, or the way the stars above sharpened until they looked less like distant suns and more like eyes. I pressed my palms flat to the ground again. The hum pulsed, stronger, carrying with it a warmth that seeped into me like fire through frost. It wasn't draining, not like the rest of the forest had. It was feeding me, or perhaps feeding on me. The line between the two blurred until I couldn't decide if I was being healed or consumed. A memory surfaced, unbidden, of something I'd once read in a collection of folklore. Clearings are not empty places, they are mouths. The phrase repeated in my mind, etched now like scripture. My gaze swept the circle again, and I realized how wrong I had been to think of it as a sanctuary. This wasn't a refuge carved into the forest. It was a trap disguised as peace. The hum quickened, my body lightening further, until I felt as if I could lift from the ground entirely. Panic surged, but my limbs refused to obey, too heavy and too light all at once. It was as though the clearing had rewired me, replacing my will with its own. My breath came in short gasps, and the air itself tasted strange, charged, metallic, like ozone before lightning strikes. I looked once more to the stars above, but they no longer felt distant. They pulsed in rhythm with the ground beneath me, forming a dome that seemed less like sky and more like a ceiling closing in. For the first time, I wondered if I was still lying in a forest at all, or if I had already crossed into the thinness the ancients had warned of. The hum reached a crescendo, and for a single shattering instant, I no longer felt lost. I felt claimed, and then it struck me, colder than the night itself. This place hadn't been waiting for anyone. It had been waiting for me. Subscribe, if you dare.